Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel. We've got Peter Collier KC, who's a retired judge and the Vicar General of the Province of York, which is a kind of fancy Church of England title for one of the most senior ecclesiastical judges in the church. We've also got Dr. Laura Oliver, who's a GP from Preston and a member of the Church's General Synod. We have the Reverend Dr. Ian Paul, who's a theologian, writer, ordained priest, and member of the Archbishop's Council and member of the Synod. We're pleased to say we've got the Reverend Jodie Stowell, who is a vicar in Harrow in London, member of the Synod, and also one of the co-conveners of the Inclusive Evangelicals group. And last but not least, Reverend Robert Thompson, who's a vicar in North London and also a member of the Synod. Thanks everyone for joining. Before we get into the panel and hear some of their thoughts, I thought it'd be helpful for those who haven't been following religiously the twists and turns of the saga of the prayers of love and faith, as they're known. These are the services of blessing for same-sex couples. Just summarise briefly what had happened at the Synod, which finished on Tuesday. So there were kind of three strands of the discussion still underway. What's known as standalone services. So some of the prayers of love and faith were introduced by the bishops at the end of last year, and those have been used by churches that wish to, but only as part of regular scheduled services. So they might be kind of tacked onto an existing Sunday service at a local parish church. But the second part of the services are standalone services. So these can take place separate from ordinary worship, and are seen by many as a kind of more significant change because they might more closely resemble an actual marriage service. So that was one strand to be discussed. There was also the question of the rules that currently bar gay clergy from entering a civil same-sex marriage. That was also on the table. And then the third strand was provision for conservatives who are very unhappy about all of these developments and what the bishops were offering there. So to briefly run through those three standalone services, the bishops' proposals were that they would be commended for a 3-year trial period from sometime next year. There had been some discussion about whether they would go through synodical authorization, which is a more kind of complex 2-year process, but that was scrapped, and so they're now going to be simply commended by the bishops for use for a 3-year trial period. There was no real resolution on the question of the ban on gay priests entering same-sex marriages. The bishops are still kind of waiting for a theological advisory report, which will come back early next year and come back to the next synod. But they did have an offer on the table about provision for conservatives. So the big offer here was what's known as delegated episcopal authority. And in summary, this would basically see churches where they had a difference of opinion with their local bishop, whether they were a liberal church with a conservative bishop or a conservative church with a liberal bishop, they could request a bishop who shared their approach, who shared their theology and background, to be given kind of delegated authority. So their local bishop would hand over most of the tasks of a bishop to a bishop from elsewhere in the church who would come in and look after that particular church. And so that was what was on the table. There was a lengthy debate, which we'll get into in a second, but just to skip to the end, it was very narrowly approved in the vote by all three houses. The margin was pretty close, particularly in the houses of clergy and laity. So that was what was happened. That was what was agreed at the Synod. I wanted to come to our panel initially and just talk about the tone and tenor of the debate. The Bishop of Leicester, who's been leading this, kind of wheeled in lots of people in working groups who have been working on kind of weekends away, and said that they'd found it a much kind of warmer, friendlier atmosphere. There were people kind of talking about friendships they'd made across their differences. Did you guys in the panel sense a kind of change in tone? Let me come to someone. Jodie, what was your take on how you felt the debate unfolded compared to previous sessions?
I think that's a fair representation. In fact, somebody else was commenting on one of my other groups this morning about the lack of camaraderie, and I immediately came in and said, actually, I feel there's quite a lot of camaraderie in Synod still, and that is both with those with whom you naturally come together and those who think quite differently. I mean, I sat, in outside of the chamber with someone. We just started chatting, and she was someone who was conservative both on, women's ordination and on LGBT LLF. issues and conversations. And we had a really good conversation, and within the chamber, for the vast majority, all of the speeches were sort of good, good-hearted, and people being clear and direct. But I think there was a difference in tone, and I really welcomed that.
Same question to you, Laura. As a Synod member, how did you find the conversation? Did you feel like there was more kind of listening, more respect, less fractious?
Yeah, I think I agree with Jodie. I think generally the tone did feel better than it has been. I think, and I referred to this when I spoke, actually, is that I think we have finally almost come to that place where Synod recognises that we fundamentally disagree with each other, and we aren't going to persuade the other that one or the other is right or not. And yet we still think that, and it was really well shown by two of the working members groups at the presentation on Saturday, that actually there is a fundamental disagreement. They both think they are right. They both think the other is wrong. But they also recognise that we're probably not going to get to a consensus from that point of view. And I think that it's taken us quite a long time to almost get to that point of seeing that is the case, and it's like, getting the bishops to actually see that this is really important to all of us on both sides of the argument and debate. Actually, what do we do now? And I think that is possibly why it felt a bit better.
Robert, let me ask you, do you agree? Do you feel like the conversation has moved on? We've kind of gone beyond some of the tit for tat of previous years, and people are actually moving on to the kind of substance of what do we do now about our disagreements?
I'm sort of maybe slightly a bit more nuanced about that. I mean, I absolutely agree with Jodie that there's a lot of camaraderie that goes on behind the scenes at Synod, and people of different theological perspectives actually get along with each other as human beings. I think I also agree with Laura that we've probably got to a stage where we know that there are real differences between us. I suppose for me, there were a couple of speeches that were really actually still problematic. And a number of those seem to imply that as a gay person with the position that I hold, wanting the doctrine of the church to change, wanting equal marriage, that my salvation might be in doubt. I mean, that's basically what was said by a couple of speakers. And I feel that is really quite problematic. And then we had the speech in which someone referred to he, she, and it, which actually a lot of people found particularly offensive. I think the reality as well from my side of the argument on LLF and PLF is that there is a difference, because actually where we're going with the PLF does not imply that people in Laura's position have to have what we will be able to do imposed upon them. So I think that's a real difference that we need to acknowledge.
Ian, can I come to you next? I'm interested in your thoughts that there was a big push from Martin Snow, the Bishop of Leicester, who's leading this, who's kind of saying, look, no one's going to get what they want. The Liberals will give up something. The Conservatives get something. We'll meet in the middle. It'll be a classic Anglican compromise solution. That didn't really appeal to any Conservatives that I heard. Is that a fair summary?
I don't think it appeals to anybody. And as Laura says, it's not actually possible. I mean, there's no church in the world that's managed that. Why the bishops think that suddenly we can invent something that other churches debating this for absolutely years have never been able to find, and they can't even articulate what it looks like. And we're just sort of pushing along on this kind of hopeful middle way, which is never going to resolve. Then it just seems like, I'm just looking at the pigs flying out, in formation outside my window. I do think I agree with other people that, there was a better clarity of discussion. I ought to just reply to Robert that Daniel's offensive speech was offensive to everybody. He didn't speak for anybody but himself. So it's not possible to sort of attribute his speech to one side of the debate. It doesn't belong there at all. And the other speeches showed that very clearly. But I think what was noticeable and what was the change, Martin Snow had said, when he took on his role in January, he wanted a reset, and he wanted greater transparency. Now, we only had a little bit of transparency. He said at one point, if I'm a little bit honest, well, we can't have a little bit honest. But what did transpire from his honesty, particularly in the question session was it Saturday evening, the presentation and questions, two things transpired. One was that he admitted that the so-called trial standalone services weren't a trial. There's no mechanism by which material that's authorized for trial can then be rescinded. He said it would be a permanent change. Well, there's a little bit of honesty, which the bishops have been concealing from us up till now. And then Sam Corley said, well, you can't have a priest blessing a relationship which they themselves can't enter. Well, oh, hang on a minute, Sam. We were told the very basis of these PLFs introduced was that you're not blessing the relationship. You're only blessing the individuals in it. You're not saying anything about the relationship. Well, here we are. The cat's out of the bag. So actually what we've discovered is that this whole thing is a domino process. So first of all, we want to welcome gay people in the church. Well, all the churches that I know, the Anglican, not conservative, the Anglican churches, we actually believe the doctrine of the church, all welcome gay people, but we can have these prayers of love and faith in a service. Oh, well, if we have those, we can have them in a standalone service. Oh, if we have those as a standalone service, well, then we must allow clergy to enter same-sex marriage. Well, if we allow clergy to enter same-sex marriage, then, we've arrived at a change of doctrine without even talking about change of doctrine. And that's what's become really clear. And that's why this synod, I think, has been a watershed. And I think correlated to that, the other thing that's become really clear is that there are a good number of bishops who want to see the doctrine of the church change. So that means they don't believe the doctrine of the church, despite the vows they took in public, but they're not prepared to do that honestly. They're not prepared to say to Synod, we want the doctrine of the church changed, let's have a debate on voting it. What they've been doing for the last 2 years is they've been doing it covertly. They've been hiding their work. They refuse to publish the legal advice. They refuse to publish the communications. They refuse to publish minutes of their meetings. And so it's all happening behind closed doors, so that somehow, a year down the road, we'll have a rabbit out of the hat saying, oh, look, the doctrine's changed. Well, there we go. So I think that's all become very clear, this synod.
I'm interested in talking to someone, Jody or Robert, from the other side of the aisle. How does it feel like from your side when you observe the arguments made by people like Ian or Laura, who accuse us of kind of doctrine change via the back door and kind of think that the bishops are kind of pulling the wool over their eyes? What are the responses from kind of the liberal, inclusive, affirming side of the church?
I think that's really disingenuous, actually, of Ian to say that. I don't think any of that has been hidden. I think, there have been bishops who have said, that they would look towards the evolving nature of doctrine, and particularly towards marriage, but that the PLF are not indicative of a change of doctrine. So those are actually two different things, and that to me has been very clear. From the beginning in February 2023, when we voted for this, and I think that gets lost sometimes, that actually this is 18 months on from when Synod voted for the PLF resources and standalone and all of that to be offered by the bishops. We are a number of months on. A lot of us in Synod have felt that it's been a bit Groundhog Day, having to vote again and again, and to essentially offer the bishops the liberation from, and the permission from Synod to go ahead with these. So we have been doing it again. It feels like it's been completely transparent and clear to me what is happening. All of those things that you said, Tim, at the beginning, and with regards to clergy being able to enter civil same-sex marriages, and the standalone services, and the pastoral reassurance, that has all been on the table from the beginning. We're just working this through. I think it's really, really important, and it's added to what we've been doing in Synod, to know that the bishops don't agree with each other, that we're not just going to get sort of en bloc a sort of slightly bizarre voting system from the bishop. So I think that is clear. I think that's transparent, and I think that's a good thing. So I'd be interested to know what Robert thinks.
I think one of the narratives that is about is that the church is too divided at present, the bishops are too divided, and we can't move forward. The reality is, yes, the church is divided on this issue, but it's people like me, LGBTQIA plus people, who have to bear the weight of that unity. So what it seems to me is that PLF is asking is that conservative colleagues and conservative sibling Christians are asked to bear some of that weight, and they're not able to. The second point I'd like to make is in relation to what Ian said about the doctrine of the church. I think those bishops who want equal marriage, I think they've been open and transparent about that. There was a letter written by those bishops. I don't think it is contradictory for someone to hold the present position and doctrine of the church and to argue for a change in it. If that were the case, there would be no argument within the church for the change in any doctrine. It's exactly analogous to my position on the monarchy. I mean, I swear allegiance to and an oath of allegiance to the monarch when I'm instituted into a position in the church, but I am a Republican and I will argue for a change for a more democratic and Republican state.
This seems like a good point to bring in our guest, Peter Collier, who's our kind of ecclesiastical legal expert here, because we've heard there was a big point of contention in the Synod was about whether or not the prayers of love and faith, the PLF, indicate a departure from the doctrine of the Church of England in any essential matter. I think I've got that right. Could you just explain to us what exactly is at stake here? What's the legal test? Surely if the bishops do it, it is by definition okay. Is that how this works?
I think the position is that, particularly in relation to changes of liturgy, they can be done in a number of different ways, provided that it isn't indicating a change of doctrine or indicating a departure from doctrine in any essential matter. I think from my point of view, trying to look at it fairly objectively, if you are saying that we have a doctrine of marriage that says you cannot marry a man and another man, and therefore what we're going to do is to provide something that will enable us to welcome them into the church, as Ian was talking about. And if you're welcoming somebody, you may want to sort of pray for them and bless what their lives. Then you're saying we can't marry you, but we will do this instead because we can't marry you. So I don't see how that can be seen as a change of doctrine. Or indicative of departure from the doctrine in any essential matter, because you're still saying whatever some of us might like to do, we cannot do that, and therefore we will do something different. And so I just find it very difficult to see how this can be seen as a change of doctrine or indicative of departure from doctrine. I know some people say, well, what does the man sitting on the bus driving past the churchyard where they see people coming out, maybe people throwing confetti over them, surely that's indicative of a change of doctrine? The answer is no, it isn't. Whatever it might look like, you've actually got to look and examine what the wording is and what the intention is. And so that's my position, trying to be, as I say, quite objective about it in relation to that particular issue.
The actual fact of what we passed 18 months ago included the statement that there would be no change in the doctrine of the church. That is what the bishops had voted for. It's a matter of fact that they refused to reveal the legal advice. It's a matter of fact that they refused to table the minutes of their meetings, which are always supposed to be public. They are a house of the General Synod. It's a matter of fact, for example, they simply refused to release the paper which summarised the conversations of the LLF groups in Leicester, and we were told that was an oversight. Well, if it's an oversight, let's see it. But no, Martin Snow refused to let that be seen. So what's going on there? I mean, if someone's being disingenuous, it's not me. And the difficulty with the comment on the legal advice there from Peter is that in 2017, before we started this whole process, there was very clear legal advice. And the legal advice was an appendix to GS 2055, said any standalone service of blessing would look like marriage and therefore be indicative of a departure from the doctrine of the church, unless it was made very clear in that service that this was not a marriage, what the doctrine of marriage was, and that actually if there is a relationship which is outside male-female marriage, then it is a departure from the doctrine of the church. And we've asked in questions and had that reaffirmed that legal advice has not changed. So the proposal we were brought to Synod this time, that there would be standalone services, is very clearly in contradiction to the legal advice we've had. But of course, that contradiction has not been resolved.
Ian has said that it's in contradiction to the legal advice that we've had, but as Ian has also said, we actually haven't seen that legal advice. Now, I have some sympathy with what Ian argues in relation to transparency, and I think in relation to just the way in which the church operates in general, more transparency would be good. However, I also want to come back to what he said about what we've decided in Synod already. Well, I made an intervention opposing Andrew Corn's amendment, and I made it clear that actually what we decided in Synod was that we lamented and repented of homophobia. And we have absolutely done no work on homophobia at all and what that might look like. And in my speech, I was really clear. I said that, at the end of my first curacy, I was told by a bishop that people like me, whatever that meant, would be better off in secular employment. Lots of clergy have the experiences I have had of going for jobs, and it's quite clear that you're not going to get a job because you're simply gay. And there are occasions in which people in parishes are told that they cannot even sit on a PCC when they come out as gay or lesbian. That's what we need to work out. At the moment, I would like there to be equal marriage. I am prepared to sacrifice that at present for the unity of the church. What I am not prepared to sacrifice is the fact that Synod has agreed to combat homophobia and that we've done no work on that at all.
I would agree with Robert entirely.
You've heard Ian referring to some previous legal advice, and some of the limited legal advice that we have seen published by the bishops did include some kind of fairly coded language suggesting from the church's lawyers that it's possible it might be a departure from doctrine, though whether it's in an essential matter, that's unclear. Could you just clarify, how is this question ultimately resolved? How do we, as the church, decide once and for all if the prayers are or are not contrary to doctrine? What's the process? What's the mechanism for that?
I think that's the difficulty, because there's been a lot of talk about, the risk of legal proceedings. And the risk of legal proceedings may well be somebody taking out a complaint against somebody who does carry out these prayers. And that would be rather bizarre, because it would take us into a route which we haven't used in relation to discipline since back in the last century. When we had the clergy discipline measure in 2003, that introduced a new system for dealing with discipline, except in relation to matters of doctrine, ritual, and ceremony. That still has to be prosecuted under the old ecclesiastical jurisdiction measure of 1963. And what most people don't understand is just how complex that is. I don't even know that the bishops necessarily understand how complex it is when they talk about being worried about that. I mean, first of all, you can't simply launch that and it goes off to the court. The court, which at the end of the day consists of 5 people, 3 bishops and 2 Court of Appeal judges. Before you get there, first of all, if the complaint's laid, somebody has to have the right to go and talk to the bishop about it. And the bishop at that point can veto the proceedings and say, this is going no further. If the bishop doesn't veto it, it then goes to a commission of inquiry, which is a group of 5 people who have to investigate it. And they themselves could decide, well, it's not in the interests of the Church of England that this goes any further. Only then would it actually go to the court. So I think the possibility of this ever ending up in court is really quite unlikely. I think people would tend to say, because, certainly when people have brought proceedings under the clergy discipline measure in relation to clergy who have actually gone into a same-sex marriage, the one case that's quite well known, the bishop dismissed it, but issued what was described as an informal rebuke. And that was really quite extraordinary. And other cases that there's simply been no desire on the part of bishops to bring this to a head before some sort of tribunal. So the prospect of doing it before the Court of Ecclesiastical Causes Reserve, I think, is pretty thin. And even if it got to that stage, if somebody was convicted by that court of committing some ecclesiastical offence, the maximum penalty for a first offence is simply admonition, which is a direction not to do some specific act again. So that would be that would be the result at the end of the day if it went all the way and there was a conviction. Don't do it again.
Come back to Laura. we've heard quite a lot on the floor of the chamber about some conservative voices saying if this vote was passed as it was, there would be really kind of serious consequences for the future of the Church of England. And there are various conservative groups such as the Alliance or the Church of England Evangelical Council who have kind of been creating plans. Could you just explain a little bit about why do conservatives feel so strongly that this is not something they can agree to disagree on, and what exactly if you could share any more about the parallel province, if you're aware of, or what are the steps that some of the conservative groups are planning?
Actually, it comes back to what Robert said earlier. He said, he felt on the floor of Synod that he was being told that potentially the things that he believes are a salvation issue, and that maybe his salvation was in question. And I think ultimately it does come down to that, is that I feel that this is a salvation issue. This is something that we agree that we disagree, but we can't agree to disagree on it because it is such a fundamental issue. I am LGBT, I am gay, and the number of times I sit in that chamber and feel totally missed out and totally ignored, like I don't exist, or others like me don't exist. I don't choose to live my life because I think, I'm specifically called to singleness or celibacy. I live my life the way I do because that is how I interpret the scriptures to how God commands me to live. He says that the better way for me to live is to deny having a relationship with a woman. So I think sometimes it's sort of that is missed, that this idea that somehow I think I'm specifically called to live in this particular way. It's not. I think it's a salvation issue. I think that actually, for me from the way I read God's word, is I think if I were to pursue a relationship with a woman, that would be against what God says is best for me and would be sinful, and therefore I wouldn't be in right relationship with God. So that, I think, that nuance, that nuance is just missed, in that actually, that's why we disagree so fundamentally, because actually it isn't, it's sometimes compared to the women ordination, women bishops. It's not the same. It is not the same situation at all, because this is a salvation issue. This is so fundamentally important that I can't see a situation in which I can stay within this church if there is a move towards this, because it is so far opposite to what I think is right. And as I say, I totally accept and understand that others believe that the way they interpret the scriptures is right as well. I understand that. But I have to have integrity. The reason I live my life the way I do is because I believe it wholeheartedly. I'd be completely, if I didn't have integrity and just said, "Oh, it's okay though," because I don't think that's what it actually says for everybody. I can't say that, but I do recognise that other people don't read the word the way I do. But I can't sit with those two things together without thinking, but they're so incongruent. I don't know how to hold them together at all.
What would change for you as a lay member of the Church of England if it was to, as it seems, to go down this route and adopts a position that you think is completely out of step with the teaching of the Bible? What would the consequences for you be? Would you feel like you needed to have some form of separation from the bishops and clergy in your part of the Church of England because you can't share that space anymore?
Yeah, I think so. I wouldn't be in good conscience be able to say that we are in good fellowship with each other, because there is such a move away. So I think, I really hope that doesn't happen. But if this trajectory that we seem to be on, and the Bishop Martin Snow on at the presentation said that there is now a majority in the House of Bishops that wants to change the doctrine of the Church, that would like to see that happen. If that's the trajectory that we're on, I couldn't stay in good faith within the Church, and I would have to leave. I say I really hope that doesn't happen, but I couldn't stay.
And Ian, I'd like to hear a little bit more about some of the more formal moves you might be aware that groups like the Alliance and CEEC are taking. We've heard talk of what's been called a parallel province. And on Friday, I believe, tomorrow, the CEEC are going to be commissioning some people as overseers. Could you share a bit about what these moves are and where they come from?
Yes, certainly, Tim. I mean, I find myself in quite an interesting position in relation to the things the Alliance has said and CEC's own position. And CEC for a long time has said that there needs to be structural provision. I think, and the reason for that is precisely what Laura has said. But I think the thing I struggle with on that is that I'm actually agreeing with Robert and others who say, well, we're not quite clear how that could work. The bishops have certainly said that. I'm certainly unclear about how that could work. But I think we need to dig down a little bit more into the reasons for that. And again, I want to keep correcting you from calling me a conservative. I'm not a conservative. I'm an Anglican. The idea that believing the doctrine of the church, which I vowed to in my ordination, makes me conservative, I think is a little bit sort of Orwellian. I can see Robert's laughing at that comment there. But the reason for this, I mean, when Laura says, oh, it's according to how I read the Bible, we must hear that correctly. This is not Laura's personal opinion. This is actually the doctrine of the church. Canon B30 about marriage says that marriage is between a lifelong exclusive commitment between one man and one woman, according to the teaching of our Lord. So it's not Laura who believes this is what the Bible says. It's the Church of England who believes that. And again, I would add, if you read any reputable, liberal, critical scholar, including those who think that this doctrine is incorrect, they are absolutely clear. That is what the Bible says. Luke Timothy Johnson, who's a liberal Catholic scholar, says, this calls for intellectual honesty. We know what the texts say. The question is, do we believe them? Now, the difficulty for the Church of England is the Church of England, formally speaking, does believe it. It does believe this is the teaching of Jesus. And in fact, although people debate Canon B30 on marriage, the more important one from my point of view is Canon A5. Now, Canon A5 tells us where the church finds its doctrine. It finds its doctrine, number one, in Scripture, number two, in the formularies, that is the Book of Common Prayer, including its marriage liturgy, and the 39 articles and the sermons that go along with that. Now, what that means is if the bishops want to, and incidentally, I would love to have a longer conversation with Robert about this. I cannot get my head around the idea of a bishop standing in public and saying, I believe the doctrine of the church, I will expound it. And then in their ministry saying, I don't believe the doctrine of the church because I want to see it change. You can't believe the doctrine of the church and want it to change at the same time. So something there has got to give. But what's going to happen if the bishops want to change the doctrine of the church? What they're going to first have to do is redefine the church itself by revising Canon A5. You cannot change Canon B30 without changing Canon A5. And in fact, every other church that's changed its doctrine of marriage has done precisely that. If you look at around the Anglican Communion, for example, the churches which have changed their doctrine of marriage had previously, in some previous generation, they'd already detached themselves from the formularies of the Book of Common Prayer. We have not. We are an institutionally conservative organisation, and contrary to what Robert says, we have not changed any of our doctrines. And I can tell you that because the canons and liturgy have not been changed.
Thank you. I wanted to come to Jody to pick up this issue about some of the moves the Conservatives are making. You're a vicar priest in the Diocese of London, where there's large numbers of maybe not conservatives, let's call them Orthodox, whatever language, whatever label.
Historic Anglicans will do.
Whatever the labels are highly contentious. Let's move beyond labels.
Yeah.
Jody, does it matter to you if some of your clergy colleagues in the diocese kind of unilaterally declare themselves to be part of a parallel province and choose some different overseers rather than the actual Bishop of London? Does that concern you at all, or are you happy for them to go and do whatever they want?
In some ways, I'm happy for them to go and do whatever they want. But no, it does matter to me. It matters to me that we are connected ecclesiologically and continue to be so. And I guess I wanted to, say for me, I'm a parish priest. I've always been involved, in fact, since before I was ordained, but, with the wider conversations that happen in the Church of England and in the Anglican Communion. But I am a parish priest, and I guess I want to say at the local level, and I think the vast majority of local parishes are ones which have people in them which think differently on LLF, PLF, LGBT plus inclusion. We are going to stay together because we are bonded in the love of Christ. So we will think differently on this. But if we genuinely do not think that we can stay together, if we think differently on this, then local parishes throughout this country are going to be fractured. I'm a glass half full person by nature. So, perhaps there's a bit of naivety in this, but when I look at my own parish, I think that isn't going to happen. We've had these conversations. We've got LGBT people in the congregation. We've got people who think very, very strongly that, same-sex marriage cannot be drawn, and accepted through looking at their interpretation of scripture. And yet we are going to stay together. So I want to take that kind of model from the local, which is the place where we're doing the building of the kingdom of God, up into the structures. And I just also wanted to say that actually at the time, and still, people still see women's ordination as a salvation issue. So I just want to say that very clearly, that it wasn't all, rainbows and kittens, and it still isn't. And, I've been called as, the spawn of Satan, and, that actually any woman who is ordained is following Satan, and our salvation has for sure been in question. So I don't think it's all that different, actually. And what I said in my speech at Synod was that the conversation that we're actually having is about the intrinsic and equal humanity of LGBTQIA plus people, which is what we are and we're having about women and women's ordination. Is our humanity effectively as equal as a man's humanity? Can we represent Christ in that place? And that's the conversation that we're having now. That's why it's so, that's why we're so exercised about it, in actual fact.
Quickly come to you again, Peter. Is there any legal meaningfulness to an organisation setting up a de facto parallel province? Does this actually allow conservative vicars to kind of avoid any fellowship or legal responsibility to their actual diocesan bishops, or is this kind of mostly for show?
I don't really know what the legal position is about that. I would have thought that is fairly fundamentally probably a matter of discipline, but that's something that I would need to give a bit more thought to. But I would like to just come back on something that Ian said about Canons B30 and Canons A5. I think we have quite a short institutional memory in the Church of England, because until 1990, it was absolutely impossible for somebody who had divorced and remarried to become a clergy person. In 1990, that was changed. The way it was changed was by changing that measure back from 1964, by allowing the archbishops to grant a faculty, in other words, to grant permission, notwithstanding the fact that our doctrine says that marriage is a lifelong union, to allow them to be ordained, provided they went through various processes that the archbishops would devise and have devised. Our very last synod, we were rather appalled at the way that was operating. And there was an acceptance that people do divorce and remarry and can become clergy people. But it went further than that, because in 2000, until 2002, the clergy weren't allowed in their churches to remarry people who had been divorced. And that was changed in 2002. And that was again done by a decision of Synod, not by a 2/3 majority. And there was an appeal to the courts, a case somebody called Brown and others took Archbishop Rumsey to the civil courts to say that they hadn't followed proper procedure. And the court said, well, no, the Synod is quite capable of making those decisions. This was not a matter of doctrine. They were simply deciding matters of process and how that should be done. And Will Adam, in his book, explains how this is really a modern exercise of what's traditionally been known as dispensation. It's the church saying, well, this is what our doctrine, this is what our law says, but in the present circumstances, for various reasons, we're prepared to allow people not to follow the official line by way of a dispensation. And it's rather difficult for me as a lawyer to see what the difference is between that lifelong union, which is part of B30, being allowed to be dispensed with, and why it isn't possible in some way to allow us now to pray for people who have entered into a same-sex marriage.
I think Peter's answered his own question, because what he precisely said was that the reason it was allowed and the reason the Synod could do it and the reason it was a proper process is because it was not a change of doctrine. Our definition of marriage in B30 has not changed. It still is a lifelong union. When I remarry in certain circumstances, people who have divorced and have their previous partner still living, I still admit them into a lifelong union. We haven't changed the liturgy to say lifelong union unless you change your mind and get divorced. The doctrine has not changed. And many people go through a process of repenting for what the failure from before they enter into what they believe will be a lifelong union. So Peter's language has shown how different these things are. Everyone has agreed that allowing people to enter a same-sex marriage would be a change of doctrine, and that is the difference.
I find it difficult then to see how you can have more than one lifelong union at the same time.
You have a lifelong. You don't have it at the same time. You have a lifelong union which fails and breaks. And the point is, the canon and the liturgy have not changed, and that shows, as you said, it's not a change of doctrine. Same-sex marriage would involve a change of both.
But I want to come to a question from Charlie Bell, who's written in the chat. Charlie, do you want to ask your question directly?
Yeah, so we've had a lot about what being Anglican means. I'm just intrigued as to how we can say that the CEC's commissioning of overseers, of course, the word overseer being a terribly not thinly veiled description of episcopa. How is that not breaking the canons of the Church of England?
I don't think this is setting up a sort of parallel legal jurisdiction. It clearly isn't. What it's doing is stepping in the breach to provide spiritual oversight for people who are in impaired communion with their bishops, because their bishops are not upholding and teaching the doctrine of the church. I mean, as a matter of fact, I think it's public record, I have told Justin and Stephen that I'm in impaired communion with them because I think they're undermining the doctrine of the church. And that's a recognized thing to do. What defines us, I mean, it was interesting that, we're still not even getting to the point where we agree what we're talking about. So Jody said, we're debating the humanity of LGBT people. No, we're not. I'm not saying anything. None of us who believe the doctrine of the church, none of us are saying that LGBTQ people are less human, less valuable. We're debating sexual ethics and patterns of marriage, and that is a distinct thing. So if we can't even agree what we're debating, and I think one of the things that really came out in really forcefully for me in the Synod debate is we were given a 56-page paper on trust. And I had a visceral response to that because, as one of the co-authors has presented the paper, I just had this visceral reaction to it because what the paper showed is that we are in such a bad place as an institution. And it's no good saying you have to obey your bishop because it's the institution and that's it. The bishops are charged with upholding and teaching the doctrine of the church. And what members of CEC are saying is, how can I, with integrity, minister when my bishop is actually undermining the doctrine of the church? And he's undermining everything in the church. The other presentation we had was on church growth.
Yeah, sorry, I appreciate it's not a legal change. That wasn't the point I was making. The canons do not only refer to the legal authority of bishops. There are all kinds of things in the canons and in the oaths that we take when we become clergy, and in all things lawful and honest obedience to bishops. And that is and what is being suggested in the CEC commissioning of alternative overseers, not of oversight, but of alternative overseers, is a clear contradiction of the canons. And I do not understand how this can be not just thrown away with reference to legalities, not thrown away with the relevant and unconnected points. How is this not breaking the canons of the Church of England? And nobody has yet been able to explain that to me or to anybody else.
The answer again is what Charlie said, in all things legal and honest. And again, what was really manifest in this synod was that the bishops have not been honest.
We've heard that point. Can I come to another question? Heather asked, if we're living with difference at a local parish level, how does discipleship and service work for anyone in the LGBTQI community who wants to serve in a church but are not allowed to because of their sexuality? How do we maintain genuine respect and difference but grow together well?
First, I want to say to Jodie that at no point, you mentioned, you talked about women ordination, and at no point do I think that you're a spawn of Satan or anything like that. That you said that there's nothing at all there. I think that is a topic we can agree to disagree on, and I just want to make that really clear. That is not what I think in the slightest. But with the overseers and with this question on discipleship, I think for me again, how do I hold to what I am convinced is right, if my bishop is actively encouraging me to do something else, or is actively encouraging someone else to do the complete opposite. Without there is no integrity again in the idea that my bishop could 1 minute be, encouraging someone in a same-sex relationship, talking about using the prayers of love and faith to bless their relationship, being involved in a service, whatever it might be, and then in the next minute be somehow pastorally leading me, and actually encouraging me in the complete opposite way, where I say, actually, I need some encouragement to keep going, because actually sometimes this is hard, and I need the encouragement to keep being obedient to the Lord. And, I know that Jesus says he gives me life to the full, and I need reminding that that's true, even when things feel difficult. And so that, I think, is where, both in terms of discipleship within the local church and with the overseers, it really depends on what you're believing. And if we are believing the historical teachings of the church, then it is to encourage people like me to keep living the way I am, and I can be completely involved and serving in my church and being in leadership, and being part of that. That's wonderful, but that's why there is some need for something, because there's such a mismatch with that idea that the bishop could be presenting something so opposite at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I had lots of sympathy for Laura's position, and I found Laura's speech at Synod really moving. However, from what Laura has just said, she would find it difficult to be in communion with a bishop who was allowing people like me to use PLF either as priests or to have them said for myself and my partner, because that would be the opposite of what she has chosen to do in relation to her interpretation of Scripture. And I suppose it's that I find difficult, because absolutely nobody is forcing Laura to live her life differently. Absolutely everyone within the church will respect Laura's position of how she has chosen, with her reading of Scripture, to live her life as a gay person, as she has chosen to. And I don't see why that is contradictory at all. So that's just the basic issue. But going back to the question about parallel jurisdictions, it does seem to me that when you say that you're setting up a third province, although Ian says it has no legal validity, that actually what you are doing is you're saying to the church at large, that is what we want, and we're going to force your hand on it. And that does feel to me slightly like bullying. And then thirdly, in relation to the question that Heather asked, I think the really important thing here is, and Jodie will probably have much more knowledge of this in relation to her own parish. A parish like mine is pretty much unanimously in favour of wanting equal marriage, and we will argue for that, and I will continue to argue for that, even though at present I practice the doctrine of the church, to come back to Ian's point. But it does seem to me that we need to acknowledge parishes like Jodie's, in which there is a diversity of opinion. And there's a diversity of opinion which means that, going back to Laura's position, you can, as a priest within that parish, and you can, as a bishop in that diocese, allow people of Laura's integrity to exist while allowing people of my integrity to exist also.
I just want to reiterate what Ian said earlier about that, is that, I am choosing to live the way I am living because of how I read the Bible and how I interpret the Scriptures, but that is also the traditional teachings of the church. I am following what the church says currently is the right way for me to live. So I understand that we disagree on whether or not that should change, but again, it's not my personal sort of specific choice or specific decision or specific calling for me. I am following what I read as the teachings of the church. I just wanted to just make that clear, but I do take your points, Liz. Thanks.
We're coming to the end, but just before we wrap up, I'd love to ask a question to a couple of people. Like, where does the church go from here? What does 2025 look like? I mean, we're now 18 plus months into the PLF argument. We're not, as we've heard in this Zoom conversation, we're not really reaching a meeting of minds. I'd love to take a few different thoughts. Maybe coming to you, Jodie, first. What's coming next? Are you optimistic about the future of this conversation? Will we ever find a settlement?
As I said, I'm glass half full, naturally optimistic person. And I think I just want to tie that in, I guess, with what Heather was asking, which was about how do we do this in the local parish? Because fundamentally, that's why I get involved in these wider conversations, because it comes to bear on those local parishes who are proclaiming the gospel and building the kingdom of God in their particular context, in their particular area. I had a conversation with my PCC, not, just a couple of weeks ago, on whether we were going to offer the PLF. And it was a very generous conversation between people who think very differently. And there was no indication that if we decide to go ahead to offer them, that the people who strongly, disagree with that would in any way be leaving. So I guess I just want to say that I believe that that's possible for us at a macro level. I think that that's what I can see happening. And I can hear the strength of feeling from Laura and Ian. And there's a lot of my compassion, I guess, which hears that and is concerned for that. But in the end, I want us all to remain together, because I think we'll be diminished without each other. And I do believe that that is possible, and that's where we're going. Thank you.
Laura, can I ask you the same question? What do you see the future hold if it seems like the bishops aren't receptive to the argument that you're making, and that they are going to push ahead with these big changes that you feel you can't accept? Is it plausible that you would end up leaving the Church of England, do you think, in the near future?
I hope very much that I don't, but I think it is plausible. Yeah. I think I said on Monday, I don't want to leave the Church of England. It's my church. It is the church in which I became a Christian at the age of 22, 23. I absolutely do not want to leave. But there was a speech that talked about feeling like we were on a bus that was, going very fast and actually running us over. And that is what it feels a bit like. I really hope I don't leave the church at all. Absolutely. I think the only way that if things carry on in the way that they are, and all these things get passed as they have been so far, that I can stay is with some very specific and helpful pastoral provision for people like me and people who believe the things that I do. Because without that, I absolutely wouldn't be able to stay. So something needs to happen. Something needs to be offered that is workable, that allows us to stay together. Because that is absolutely my desire. I echo what Jodie said. We are better together if we can stay together. So if we can, that is absolutely what I would pray for.
Peter, can I ask you a similar question? Do you see hope for a resolution, a lasting settlement emerging at some point, or is some kind of schism inevitable at this stage?
Well, I hope and I pray that we are able to maintain some sort of unity. But quite how that's going to work out, I simply don't know. I just see there are some very entrenched positions, and some people who I think are very determined to try and achieve what both sides want what they want, but some at the expense of unity. I think that's how it looks to me. I would just come back on one thing from Ian, that back in 2002, back in 1990, a huge number of people then regarded the doctrine of the church as meaning lifelong union meant lifelong union, and you could not break it. You now have a very different position yourself about that, but there are still some people who regard lifelong union as meaning you cannot remarry divorced people. And there are some people in Synod who still have that position. So these things are shifting and not as straightforward as I think Ian suggested.
No, but the interesting thing, Peter, is that that's what Cranmer thought as well. So it's hardly a novel view that I'm taking. Just Tim, can I just note that, again, the dialogue here, it's lovely that Robert and that Jodie are being generous, but what they're saying to us is this is a thing indifferent. This is something on which we can agree to disagree. No church has ever believed that. Nowhere in Scripture has it said that. The Church of England has never said said that. The Church Catholic has never said this is a thing we can agree to disagree on. No other denomination in the world has found the kind of settlement they say they hope for. So unless something amazingly magic happens, I mean, I don't understand why we as the Church of England think that we can do something which no one else has ever achieved. But I'll tell you one thing that has happened to every single Western denomination which has changed its doctrine of marriage, is that it is divided and it has declined. We're already looking at the fact that we've dropped by 50% in the last 14 years. The Church of Scotland, when it changed its doctrine of marriage, it dropped by 40% in the following 6 years. So if this continues, and if the bishops try and force their hand, the Alliance and CEC actually standing up and saying, look, we're not going to be bullied anymore. If this continues, then one thing that's absolutely certain about the Church of England is it's going to continue in its precipitate decline.
The reality there is that Ian is focusing in on one issue, and there are other issues why churches may be in decline. Safeguarding and the way we deal with them is one of them, and that is one of the issues that I brought to this synod. But secondly, actually, the decline in particular numbers of a particular denomination when a church decides to be generous to those of us who are LGBTQIA+, is often to do with those who leave. So numbers are going to go down.
Well, we could talk about this all day, as you can tell, but we are going to have to come to an end. Thank you so much, Ian, Robert, Jody, Laura, and Peter, and everyone else for following along and asking questions. I'm sorry I couldn't come to all of them in the chat. Do keep an eye out on the Religion Media Centre's YouTube page. This will be shortly uploaded there, along with all the other briefings that we run every week. I'm sure we'll come back to this topic again because it's not going anywhere. But thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.